Two dark depictions of sex bookend Twin Peaks: The Return. Hot and heavy youths are torn to pieces by an apparition in Part 1, and a fire-haired Diane Evans is uncomfortably joined with Dale Cooper at a motel set to 1950s pop in Part 18. By reflecting on Diane's restoration, looking deeper at events in Part 8, and examining the related subplot in the secret history novel, these sex scenes are presented as functional to the plot of ridding Twin Peaks of the extreme negative force known as Jowday or Judy. Indeed, the narrative elements of Twin Peaks: The Return are impossible to speak of in absolutes. However, these points of interest are connected to the historical surrealist painter Marjorie Cameron, and by extension the occult concept known as the Scarlet Woman. Through a mystical lens, this video explores Cameron's place in occult history, Diane as this avatar, and the final sex act of the return as a ritual to lure Jowday through a metaphysical doorway. References to Cameron pinpoint where Lynch and Frost jointly drew inspiration for the 18-hour saga, a meeting in the desert, as it were. Though the Scarlet Woman nomenclature is never used in the secret history novel, nor is the occult concept ever described, Frost cemented a connection by including a small but conspicuous crop of Cameron, taken from experimental filmmaker Kenneth Anger's 1954 inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, an image of a painter, muse, and artist that conceivably haunts Lynch as well. Sex magic speculation and comparisons of Diane to Cameron immediately followed the 2017 airing of The Return. Reddit user Wilson Keel correctly notes Cameron's, quote, striking red hair, chain-smoking, cantankerous personality, and self-portrait called The Black Egg, and states, quote, it seems impossible that all of these parallels between her and Diane are just coincidence. Film critic and Twin Peaks scholar Frank Bouleg definitively declares on his Unwrapping the Plastic blog, quote, Diane's hair is no accident. It visually connects her to Marjorie Cameron, the Scarlet Woman, and Babylon. Bouleg also believes the conjugal moment between Diane and Cooper is, quote, really a moment of sex magic, a way to open a portal. Part 1 of The Return shows two young people involved in a secret New York experiment, a Manhattan Project, if you will, who have sex near what can be gleaned as a doorway to behind the curtain. This results in the appearance of a demonic figure who escapes and proceeds to maul them to death. As the new tale of Twin Peaks begins, the force, credited as the experiment, is eventually established as the underlying conflict in the narrative.
Diane, 11:30 a.m., February 24th.
After being referenced constantly, but never seen in the original television series, nor the Fire Walk With Me film, a very blonde Diane Evans appeared in the flesh for the first time in Part 6 of The Return, to the delight of Twin Peaks fans. Diane is asked to assist the Blue Rose Task Force in investigating the exploits of Cooper's doppelganger, Mr. C, and spends the majority of the series drinking and chain-smoking with a chip on her shoulder.
Fuck you, Gordon.
She's presented as a conflicted character in behavior, aesthetic, and allegiance, serving as a secret spy for Mr. C, while simultaneously helping the FBI track his whereabouts. On a psychological level, Diane is at odds with herself, coldly responding to her master's orders, while also acting in earnest to benefit Gordon and the team.
Let's rock.
She is also symbolically hinted at having more than one side, often wearing double bracelets, and an explicit instance of adorning dual dragons. This fissure inside Diane culminates in Part 16, when she is ordered to assassinate the Blue Rose team in the South Dakota hotel.
You raped me.
Diane emotionally breaks down while revealing she was sexually assaulted and ostensibly put under Mr. C's control years prior. Thwarted from completing her mission, she vanishes after being shot, and it is learned that Diane up to this point was in fact not the real Diane, but a tulpa, a manufactured being like Dougie Jones. The near midpoint of The Return showcases a flashback to the detonation of the first nuclear device in 1945, known as the Trinity Test. After the explosion, a floating creature, also credited as the experiment, spews forth the Bob orb, and a substance not unlike other characters after an electromagnetic disturbance. The Secret History of Twin Peaks novel was released in October of 2016, 7 months before the airing of The Return. The book contains a seemingly endless number of connecting points, including sparse references to the Manhattan Project and the bomb. planting seeds for readers that would come to bear visual fruit. The 30-plus page section entitled The Coming of What picks up the story of Major Douglas Milford, who was sent to investigate Jet Propulsion Laboratory co-founder and engineer Jack Parsons at the behest of then Representative Richard Nixon, who sat on the House Un-American Activities Committee. The inquiry comes after Nixon interviews future Scientology founder L. Ron Hubbard, who recounts events beginning in August of 1945, 1 month after the Trinity test. Marvel John Whiteside Parsons was an enigmatic figure of American history who, in addition to being a brilliant chemist and rocket fuel pioneer, was a devout follower of British occultist Aleister Crowley and his mystical religion, Thelema. In conversations with Mark Frost, he told author David Bushman that he saw these ideas as, quote, relevant to what we were working on in Season 3, and to, quote, foreshadow where we were headed, to suggest a way of interpreting what the audience was about to see. When asked if Lynch's interpretation of the events in Part 8 were similar, Frost said, quote, it seemed in concert when we were writing, but I can't vouch for what he was thinking or where he went with some of it afterward. Now adept at exploring supernatural phenomena, Major Milford is sent to investigate. He poses as a journalist and comes face to face, in a coffee shop no less, with Parsons, who divulges that he and Hubbard had been conducting ritual work in the New Mexico desert. Having been stationed in Roswell, Milford replies, that's where they tested the bomb, to which Parsons responds, such a fertile ground for the working of Babylon, calling forth the elemental. The conversation is cut short by the sound of a car horn, and, quote, a striking Technicolor redhead is seen behind the wheel of a Buick Roadster convertible. The Babylon working was historically a magical operation designed by Parsons to bring about the occult goddess Babylon and usher in a new age called the Aeon of Horus. Annotations in the Twin Peaks novel explain with accuracy that Crowley's Thelema borrowed from and reinterpreted the biblical, apocalyptic Book of Revelation, which includes a vision of the Whore of Babylon. In Thelema, Babylon, spelled with an A instead of a Y, is also the mother of abominations, but is seen as a powerful female deity, the divine representation of women, and the embodiment of sexual liberation. With Parsons as high priest and Hubbard as scribe, the working moved to the Mojave Desert in early 1946. They descended upon Parsons' favorite meditational and magical location, consisting of 2 intersecting power lines emitting a constant, ominous drone. At sunset, he felt a snap in tension and believed, quote, in absolute certainty that the operation was accomplished. Parsons returned home to find a young woman waiting for him. His Scarlet Woman had arrived, and 70 years later, the name Marjorie Cameron entered the Twin Peaks lexicon under an emblazoned image in the margins of The Secret History. Fresh out of the military with an honorable discharge, Marjorie Cameron arrived at 1003 Orange Grove Avenue in early 1946, setting her on a trajectory to become an icon of occult history and 1950s counterculture. The magnetic redhead relocated to the Los Angeles area with her family after World War II, when fate brought her to the steps of the parsonage. The Secret History of Twin Peaks repeats the legend that she was actually waiting at his front door, though historic accounts differ as to precisely how and when she first met Parsons. Regardless of circumstance, Cameron Parsons Foundation head and friend Scott Hobbs said it was love at first sight. She moved in that night, and the new couple notoriously spent the next 2 weeks together in bed. Believing she was the Scarlet Woman he had been waiting for, Parsons renamed her Candida, or Candy, and they were married within 6 months. With his elemental at his side, Parsons believed the arrival of the goddess of love and sexual power was at hand. The Babylon working could truly begin. He said in a letter to Crowley, quote, I am to invoke continually, this now being possible and easy. The Coming of What makes another reference to a, quote, striking redhead when Major Milford returns for a follow-up visit with Parsons in 1952 and notices a photo of Cameron on his wall. The couple had been planning a trip to Mexico just before Parsons was killed as a result of a chemical explosion which authorities believed to be accidental. The Los Angeles press went wild with stories of sex cults, and conspiracy theories abound to this day as to the circumstances surrounding his death, which are also played upon in the Twin Peaks novel. Cameron would later scatter his ashes in the Mojave Desert under the electrical drone of 2 intersecting power lines. She would also become a commanding presence in 50s avant-garde cinema, serving as muse for experimental filmmakers like Kenneth Anger and Curtis Harrington. The former's work is often cited as prefiguring the work of Lynch. Art imitated life when Cameron performed as the Scarlet Woman and the Hindu goddess Kali in Anger's 1954 inauguration of the Pleasure Dome. It is in this authoritative work that visual similarities can be seen between Cameron as the Scarlet Woman and Diane's manifestation at the end of Twin Peaks: The Return. Both depictions share flaming red hair and eyebrows, a mouth slightly open with ruby lips, and giant eyelashes ornamenting a bright-eyed gaze. Cameron also wears a shawl with a floral pattern similar to Diane's nightshirt. It is also from Pleasure Dome, where a still frame was taken of Cameron as Kali to represent her in the Secret History novel, appropriately displayed in the margins as a red monochrome print. Again, there is a piercing, otherworldly stare, and her dark wig seems afire with the crimson smoke of the great beast and background bacchanalia, superimposed imagery like the face of Agent Cooper. Finally, Kali bears a naked breast as her shawl hangs off her shoulder, akin to Diane's dangling bathrobe. Before the closeout of the 1950s, Cameron again sparked controversy, not by being associated with orgies and deadly explosions, but by an inflammatory piece of art. In 1955, after hearing a lecture by the Doors of Perception author Aldous Huxley, Cameron took a large dose of peyote for the first time. She said her experience with Parsons' preferred drug caused the walls to disappear, followed by a bedridden sickness and the creation of peyote vision, an ink-line drawing of a serpentine woman in the act of coitus with an alien figure. Wallace Berman featured a photo of Cameron and a print of peyote vision in his art journal Semina for the premiere issue in 1957. With peyote vision and a work presented in a later issue of Semina titled June 2, 1962, perhaps another connection can be made to Lynch. Considering their importance in the history of LA underground art, it is possible, though certainly speculative, that the surrealist painter-turned-director was influenced by Cameron's pieces, which bubbled up as inspiration for the Crimson Nightmare scene in Lost Highway, which filmed shortly after her death in 1995. Lynch's imagery, like peyote vision, depicts a woman mounted from behind by a faceless entity, with mangled hair and heavily lined eyes, similar to June 2, 1962. The saturation of red surrounding Patricia Arquette's Alice Renee amalgam is also reminiscent of Cameron as Kali from Anger's Pleasure Dome, who, again, is often cited as a precursor to Lynch. Her edgy, surrealist paintings and memorable film appearances solidified Cameron as an iconic figure in the counterculture of the time and the Scarlet Woman legend of occult history. Cameron remained in California until her death, and finally joined Parsons when her ashes were also scattered in the Mojave Desert. Narrative threads begin to come together in the run-up to the final events of The Return, starting with an information dump from director Gordon Cole in the opening of Part 17.
Zhao Day.
He divulges the existence of an extreme negative force, and that he, Cooper, and Major Briggs had come up with a plan in the past to deal with the entity named Zhao Day, now known as Judy, just before speeding off to Twin Peaks. As director of Twin Peaks, Lynch situated himself in front of the atomic bomb photograph in Part 7. Because he's the one character in the physical world who knows what Judy is, it can be reasonably deduced that the experiment from Part 1, seen and credited again in Part 8, and Zhao Day are one and the same.
Judy.
It's worth noting that Frost also acknowledged a connection between these three after the airing of The Return. At the Twin Peaks Sheriff's Station, the newly awakened Dale Cooper sends his doppelganger back to the Black Lodge once and for all, as his now fully formed consciousness watches the unfolding events from behind the curtain. Just before bidding farewell to the friends he met along the way, the mysterious being known as NATO approaches, touches his hand, and through metamorphosis is revealed to be a healed and complete Diane Evans.
Diane.
With this materialization of an idyllic woman or partner, the Scarlet Woman of occult history and Anger's Pleasure Dome finally collides with the Scarlet Woman of The Return. As stated before, both images share vibrant red hair, ruby lips, and a penetrating stare, while floral patterns exist on Diane's white pajamas and Cameron's black shawl. Yet another interesting parallel, Diane's transformative cocoon, is presented as a flesh-wrapped black oval, which can be compared in both color scheme and concept to Cameron's undated black egg painting. Cooper and Diane smile wide for the first time in decades before a passionate kiss. The celebration is short-lived, however, as Diane notices time, or timelines, are holding at 2:53, signifying an open window. They are next seen hand in hand, along with Gordon in the boiler room of the Great Northern. Cooper slips through another doorway, and after what feels like a failed attempt to rescue Laura Palmer in the past, is allowed to leave the Red Room in the present after being trapped there for 25 years. Diane is waiting for him at Glastonbury Grove, and is presented as being mended in both character and aesthetic. Perhaps most informative is that she now wears a single red bracelet, seen only once before on the table in her apartment, in lieu of the two split colored ones worn throughout.
Is it really you?
Her demeanor is also different since appearing from behind the curtain. She no longer chain smokes, and her underlying tension and anger seems to have subsided.
Do you remember everything?
Context suggests Diane is aware of Cooper's intentions and is part of the aforementioned larger plan to counter Jaude spoken of by Gordon.
430.
At the 4:30 mile mark, she is pensive,
You sure you want to do this?
but after a final kiss, she enters the portal of her own free will.
Let's go.
David Auerbach's unified theory posits that to deal with this entity, they must get Jaude to follow them. It is at this point in the 18-hour epic that the glass box in New York of Part 1 can be seen as mirroring the 430 gateway of Part 18. While the young couple inadvertently lured the creature through copulation, the magician and the Scarlet Woman will attempt to do the same with intent. Bouleg suggests that, quote, "This moment feels like an enactment of a ritual, with no joy, with closed faces." He also points out another juxtaposition in that the sex scene at the motel is very different from the humorous but intimate moment between Dougie and Janie E. in Part 10, though both assume similar positions.
Love you.
When the twilight is gone.
The 1950s romantic pop song My Prayer by the Platters plays and is underscored by a dark drone. Aside from also not feeling truly romantic, it is in fact the 45 record that spins at the radio station upon the arrival of the woodsman, connecting the dark forces of Part 8 to the conjugation of Part 18.
Diane?
Cooper awakens, Diane is gone, and the audience is reminded that despite the coffee, cherry pie, quirky music, and cute clothes, Twin Peaks often puts its characters through hell, and The Return was certainly an exercise in subversion of expectations. Cooper emerges in a new reality permeated by Judy's presence and continues on his path alone, but to what end? Like Diane's fate, the series finale will no doubt be subject to eternal debate. Though the climax of The Return is cold and ambiguous, it has been shown that the coitus in Manhattan, the Trinity test, and the final sex act between Cooper and Diane are connected to Jaude and Lynch's on-screen story, while Cameron, Parsons, and occult concepts like the Babylon Working serve as planted clues in Frost's secret history novel for those willing to go deeper into the Twin Peaks mythos. Furthermore, Frost stated the concepts surrounding Crowley and Thelema were relevant to what he and Lynch were developing for The Return, and believed Lynch was on board with said ideas during the writing process. In occult history, Babylon is a powerful deity that symbolizes feminine divinity and embodies sexual liberation. Cameron, too, was a powerful woman in her own right and aptly suited to be an inspiration for Diane. In Twin Peaks, the Scarlet Woman is an occult fantasy swirled into the existential soup that is The Return, in which Diane Evans appears as this avatar to lure Jaude through an ethereal gateway by ritual. It's a tale of mad magicians who long to see a goddess but summon a destroyer of worlds. And buried in the margins is the story of a trailblazing artist named Marjorie Cameron, whose life and work surely influenced David Lynch and Mark Frost as they were conjuring demons in the desert.